Hack the Entrepreneur is part of Rainmaker FM, the digital business podcast network. Find more great shows and education at rainmaker.fm. Hack the Entrepreneur is supported by Citi Cards with Android Pay. Listening on your phone? Now you can pay while you listen using the same device. Just tap and go. Download the Android Pay app on Google Play or visit citi.com/androidpay to get started. Android Pay is available for eligible Citi consumer credit and debit cards.
Welcome to Hack the Entrepreneur, the show which reveals the fears, habits, and inner battles behind big-name entrepreneurs and those on their way to joining them. Now here is your host, John Naster.
Hey, this is Hack the Entrepreneur. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am your host, John Naster, but you can call me Johnny. My guest today is a daily blogger, a public speaker, and a product strategist. Over the last 25 years, he has been leading teams of people, mostly through telling stories and motivating companies to bring products to market. He's been the founder, CTO, and advisor to numerous companies, and he loves to marinate in what he refers to as the problem space. Now, let's hack Chris Lema. Hack the Entrepreneur is sponsored by Citi Cards with Android Pay. How cool is it that we live in a world where you can use the same device to listen to Hack the Entrepreneur and buy your morning coffee, groceries, and more? And did I mention that it's a super fast way to pay? Just use your Citi Card with Android Pay at the register. Get in, get it, get going. Download the Android Pay app on Google Play or visit citi.com/androidpay to get started. Android Pay is available for eligible Citi consumer credit and debit cards. We are back with another episode of Hack the Entrepreneur. And today we have a very, very special guest. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hi there. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. I'm so glad that you decided to join us.
It's my pleasure.
Excellent. I think it'll be a lot of fun. Let's just jump into the first question here, Chris. I know you are a man that wears many, many hats, but today we're talking to Chris, the entrepreneur. So could you tell me, Chris, as an entrepreneur, what is the one thing that you do that you feel has been the biggest contributor to your successes so far?
Wow. It's a one thing only kind of question. And normally I punt with two answers to that question. But I would say probably the most important or useful thing I do is I listen for stories. Now, normally I couple that with constant experimentation based on those stories. But at the core of it is when you're trying to find that right product that is kind of perfect for the customer, most of us tend to go into our own brains and figure out our own answers. We figure out our own ideas and everything else. And the reality is that customers more often than not have already spent, especially if they've spent a lot of time in the problem space, they've already spent all sorts of time ideating and thinking through the solution. They're just busy doing their day job, right? And so they're looking for someone else to solve the problem for them, but they don't come at it with a, gee, I wish that someone would solve this problem somehow. They normally come up with their own narrative, their own, this is how it should work. And so most of the time, my job is listening for those stories and listening intently to hear and pull that narrative out of them.
Wow, I love it. So it's not gonna be this is how it should work. So it's the story, like the problem, right?
Well, so there's two problems to everything, right? Or there's two spaces for everything. There's the problem space and there's the solution space. And most of us spend a very tiny amount of time in the problem space and an enlarged amount of time in the solution space. So you see this little problem, right? You go into a Taco Bell, you sit down and you have some problem, right? And you go, you've barely spent a second. I mean, if you're smart, you've barely spent a second inside a Taco Bell, and yet you start figuring out, okay, this is the problem, and now you're going to spend all your time thinking about the solution. Unfortunately, you haven't spent nearly enough time to marinate in the problem space, which means that your solution, while entertaining and exciting to you, which is normally kind of an offshoot of other ideas you've had and experiences you've had, may or may not fit well. So the real trick is, if you want to solve a problem, is marinate in the problem space. And thankfully, there are a lot of people who have already done that, right? So whether you're going into a fast food joint, the manager can tell you, we have a problem with theft, right? We employ a lot of young employees, and we have this percentage of theft. And you go, you start thinking about your own solutions, and they go, what we really need is X, Y, Z. And you go, oh, wow, okay. That shapes the way I was thinking about the problem. You go in to talk with a surgeon who, operates on people and spends 6 or 7 hours in surgery. And they don't just tell you that their hands get sore and tired. They can also tell you what they wished about the gloves they wore or the tools they used. They've been marinating in the problem space for a really long time. So whether you're talking about fast food or surgery, the reality is when you connect to the right people and you pull that narrative out, you don't just get the problem. You often can get the seeds, or often even more than the seeds of the solution, by listening to those people.
Yeah. How do you feel, or how much do you trust the person, like the surgeon, who thinks that she knows what gloves are the proper gloves? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've found that oftentimes the person in that problem space, they think they know the solution to it, but it's actually not the solution that might help them the best.
Yeah. So definitely I started 5 different companies now almost a decade ago. And over the course of the decade where I was starting up companies, it was never the first conversation. It was never the first surgeon. It was never the first person you talk to. But what I found is that you needed about 20 to 30 conversations to really get a sense of where the center of gravity was around the problem and around the solution. The first couple people, in fact, almost every time, the first 3 to 5 conversations I had, I was the idiot, right? I didn't know anything about their problem. I didn't know the right words to use, right? I mean, if I said, well, in the hotel space, for example, at one point we were doing a lot of research in that space, and I would say something like heads in beds, right? And they looked at me like, oh, you mean, and they gave me some other acronym. And I was like, I didn't know the acronym. So it took me 4 or 5, calls, 4 or 5 interviews to get the terms. And then you start hearing some similarities, but it's easy. If you quit after 5 or 6 calls, it's easy to think you've heard the core issue until you get to that 10th or 15th call and you discover, oh, there's an angle or an aspect of that, a nuance of that problem that I hadn't discovered yet. And so only by the 20th, 25th, you now sound like an expert because you have heard so much about these things that you're using the right terms. You're incisive about where the narrative needs to twist or turn. And then you start getting the nuance that helps you, right? Because you're asking a more refined question.
Yeah. And most of us, you're right, want to give up at the 5th or 6th call.
Yeah.
Because we think we know. Okay, I got it. Now let's start building it.
Yep.
But you're still trying to figure out the language. So does that have to do with the second sort of leg that you put down, which is the constant experimentation? Is that
Absolutely.
what this is?
Absolutely. So the reality is, and here's what's crazy is, most of my experimentation has very little to do with building a product. Most of my experimentation is messaging, right? So, back to our surgeon, I spent a lot of time talking with a handful of surgeons at one point because we were looking into a space, and we were talking about muscle fatigue in their hands and doing surgery, and as you're digging into this, right, you are trying to reflect back to people what you've heard from other people and trying to work with them on their idea or your idea, and you're going back and forth, and you're constantly looking for, am I telling a compelling story? If I tell you, here's the problem and here's my solution, is it compelling? Is it so compelling that you're like, I would like to quit my job as a surgeon and join your company to actually sell these special kind of gloves? And if you can't get someone who's marinated in the problem space, who's so incredibly excited because, man, they know the problem, but they didn't know where they would, mass produce a glove like this or a different tool like that, or it had no clue how to go about fabricating something or getting it on shelves and distribution or anything else. If they're not excited enough to say, oh, there's more money there than what I'm doing, then maybe you haven't found the right narrative. And so you're constantly testing. And the reality is, in terms of experimentation, I find that there's tranches or groups of tests that you have to navigate through, right? So if you think about the FDA, you think about bringing a pharmaceutical drug to market, right? The first set of tests when they're evaluating a drug is, will this drug kill people, right? That's the very first tranche. The first round of tests are, will this kill someone? The second round of tests, if you demonstrate that it has, and normally you don't do that with people, you do it with like rats, but if you demonstrate that it doesn't kill anyone, then the next question is, well, is it marginally better than what exists today, right? Because again, if it's not significantly better than what exists in the marketplace today, why would you invest all that money in doing it? And it's only in the third realm of testing that you get to a whole new set of experiments to figure out, okay, how much better and what treatments and what are the side effects and all that stuff, right? So in the same way, when you're talking about ideas and entrepreneurial ideas and efforts, is do you have a structure or framework for how you go about that first set of tests? How do you go about that second set of tests? How do you go about that third set of tests? And I find that most of the time we get so excited about building something long before we've ever figured out, do we have the right people engaged? Do we have the right story that we're telling? Is it compelling enough? Is the pricing right? There's so many dynamics before I want to sit down and actually get a team together to code something.
Wow. That's cool. I didn't even know that about like the drug. Like, does it kill anyone? I guess we don't do that with software.
Yeah.
And is it significantly better? We don't.
If you were an embedded
we need
system,
like an FDA for software.
if you were building software for embedded systems and real-time systems, you'd have to pay attention to that stuff too, right? I mean, we don't think about it, but the reality is an X-ray machine or something that helps with dentistry or LASIK surgery or with your eyes or anything. There's all sorts of computerized systems, technologies that use embedded chips that have software embedded on them. And that space does require, I mean, it can physically damage people. So there's a completely different kind of rigor around how you test that kind of software than when we spend time with web software, for example.
Yeah. And so what are your thoughts on the idea? I just want to push this a bit, because the idea of sort of marinating in that problem space and like way before, talking to 30, 40 people within it, trying to figure out and then moving to a solution, but through story, and then sort of to see if it's viable, right? Like,
yep.
What are your thoughts on the idea that, let's not talk about enterprise and stuff, but just web, like a person just creating something now and putting it onto Product Hunt? Like, do you think that there should be more barrier, or do you think this is a good thing that people are like, every day Product Hunt is every little tiny idea you could possibly think of, people are throwing it like it's a lottery, like maybe I can score the next big thing here?
So I really don't pay attention to Product Hunt. I don't pay attention to most of what is considered entrepreneurial because frankly it's not that entrepreneurial. I mean, the reality for me is people talk about their side gigs, they talk about entrepreneurial efforts, etc. Most of what I've discovered about being an entrepreneur and being a product developer, specifically in building web applications and web software, is that most of it doesn't look glamorous at all. It is grind in as much as you're writing software for banks. And that kind of grind is not sexy, it's not exciting, it's not the stuff you tell at parties, because to do it right and to have success takes a lot of work. And we get excited by the handful of consumer software products, whether you're talking about Pokemon Go or you're talking about Snapchat or anything else, that just kind of appear out of nowhere and they have huge success. And that's awesome. I love that people have had that success, and I love that people are doing fun things and that they take off, and they take off seemingly with just a nice stroke of work, and then boom, it's all success. But I liken the success ratio of that to the Michael Jordans of the basketball world, right? everybody playing basketball on the playground does not become Michael Jordan. And everyone who submits something to Product Hunt doesn't become the next founder of Snapchat. And so fundamentally, that's not how you go about becoming Michael Jordan. You want to have a success. There is that chance that you just are born innately with incredible amounts of talent, or you chance upon a really great idea and you toss it on Product Hunt and it goes viral. But for everybody else, and I'm one of those everybody else's, I think that the reality is it's a matter of hard work and hard work that you can enhance your luck and opportunity by doing the hard work. You can do it by marinating in that problem space, by spending time, by asking questions, by being an observer, by collecting narratives, and by teasing out what the solution narrative might be, and then aggregating a team to go out and build something. And even then, testing and testing and testing, experimenting and experimenting, never getting anchored, because most entrepreneurs get anchored way too easily. But that looks just a lot more like regular work than it does, the kind of the sexy entrepreneurial Product Hunt life.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And so the work is it to sort of enhance, like whatever that work may be. Maybe it's consulting for a company. Maybe it's going to work for a company for the first 5 years or 10 years. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think everybody has to be a founder at 20 years old.
Exactly.
I don't think everybody can be a founder at 20 years old.
So part of the problem is when you talk about marinating in a real problem space, is it's unlikely as a consultant that you will get into the nuance of a real problem, right? So I've been an entrepreneur. I have started and sold several companies, and yet I've never been a consultant to those companies. I've never been a consultant in those spaces. I have been an employee, right? So I have joined a company, worked, teased out a set of problems, and then spun out and said, let's go build a company that solves this problem, far more than I've just sat around and brainstormed. Because the brainstorms are the first passes. They're the easy answers, right? One of my favorites is appointment setting for doctors, right? So I started working with the web in the tail end of 1994 when the web started. In 95, I heard the first pitch of someone saying, most patients just get frustrated because they want to make an appointment with a doctor and they can't do it over the web. And it would be great if they could just do it over the web. That happened in 95. People pitched it in 97. They pitched it in 99. They pitched it in 2003, in 2007, in 2010, in 2013, and this last year. And everybody and their brother is like, oh, this is just I can't believe no one's done this already. And you're like, well, actually, the reality is tons of people have tried it already. And they've all failed. And they failed because at the core of it, for the same reason that most software doesn't exist inside of a mechanic shop, the population that runs a mechanic shop or that runs a doctor's office are people who are over 50, over 60, and fundamentally don't want to adopt your technology because it's slower for them than a clipboard, a piece of paper, and a pen. And you just don't get the depth of the problem if you're sitting outside of it, coming up with this new cool idea and using the latest JavaScript to spin up a new screen that lets you do calendaring better so that you could solve this huge problem that obviously you've spent 10 minutes thinking about and that you're going to become the master of. You just don't do it. You got to sit inside an office. You got to hang out with the doctor or the mechanic long enough to go, oh, okay, wow. Yeah, my first 30 ideas are not going to work here. I built several years ago, a software product for people who inspect properties. They inspect them to make sure that there's no physical issues with the rental property or a multifamily unit. And the fancy tech we did was basically a printed form with QR codes and barcodes and other things that computers would read, collect the data, and then put it into spreadsheets automatically for people, because the rest of the technology still had to be paper-based so that these inspectors would work with it. Because if you give an inspector who's 47 a digital tablet, you have to convince the company to buy digital tablets for their staff, which becomes expensive. And then within the first day or two, the staff breaks the tablet, right? They drop it on a site because they're walking on terrain that isn't perfect, and the thing drops and it breaks and you break $1,000 device, game over. But a clipboard and a paper or pen, that thing can drop and get picked up 200 times a day. It's a totally different ballgame. And you don't discover that unless you marinate in the problem space.
Which, in your case, has been literally working for a company within that space.
Yep. Working for a company in that space, spending a lot of time in that space. I started one company years ago with a couple founders where I didn't have the experience of the problem space. One of our co-founders did, right? So they worked in telecommunications and particularly in mobile and tech, just as the analog wireless was moving to digital wireless. And so I came on as the technical guy, but they came on with the problem space after having spent problem space expertise after having spent 3 years working at Nextel. And so they could leave Nextel. And one of my other buddies had worked at Visa and again, big corporations. And we come together and say, okay, what does it look like to build a purchasing solution for companies like Visa to buy mobile solutions from companies like Nextel when Nextel mostly sells through, stores. In those days, it was physical retail. And at the same time, they have corporate accounts that do in-person negotiation. And you think, well, if the only options are physical store and in-person meetings, isn't there a space for an online distribution model? And so we built that company. It was a particular moment in time. And that's where you need someone who knows the space to be able to say, okay, what does it look like to build a B2B exchange for mobile right at this moment where things are changing and people don't understand the space well. And there's a problem that's specific to this space in that the digital carriers are getting distributed. So there's no national carrier. We didn't have AT&T and Verizon. We had GT Wireless and AirTouch and Cellular One and PacBell Mobile. And so a company like Visa that needed employees across the country to have a plan couldn't say, we work with one vendor. So we built the solution that allowed that to happen. And to do that, we had to understand both the space of, corporate procurement and the shift from analog to digital in terms of wireless. It allowed us to build a product that we were one of 10 companies that were the American Express main players. And you're looking at this list of if you remember CompUSA, right? CompUSA is on the list and you're like, oh my God, they're a huge company. And then next to it was Ice Wireless and we were 8 people. You're like, how is this 8%? We were the smallest company to have a national contract with American Express, but it was because we understood the space well and we solved a real problem.
Wow. And I guess this really goes back to the whole product hunt and sexy entrepreneurship where people are trying to create that sexy app and then you're working in a space that most people, we're aware that it exists because we use mobile devices, but it's not something that people are like, man, I want to create that.
None of my plays have been very glamorous, right? I've been doing business to business enterprise web applications for 20 years. And most of the time you experience it in a negative way, right? You're an employee for a company and you want to buy your own phone. And then the company says, nope, you got to go to this portal and you have to buy one of our selected phones. And you don't think at all about issues of liability or who owns that number when you quit. If you're a salesperson and you quit, is it your phone? Is it your phone number? Do you get all the contacts that you've been building over the last year? Or is it the company's? And whose property is that? And these are things that you don't think about, or at least you feel them as an employee as constraints. And I look at those as opportunities to make sure that companies are spending the right money on the right problems and paying me.
Wow. And so it's interesting, looking back on your history of the 20 years now, but now from where you are today, as I know it right now, I don't think you're actually working for somebody and you are doing consulting and you're obviously blogging every single day, which is probably, I'm sure, part of your listening for stories and then sort of working them out. But do you I guess what's the plan going forward? Do you want to ever go into the sexy web app sort of market, or do you want to stay with what you've done? What are you trying, how are you trying to sort out what you're doing next? Where are you listening for stories right now if you're not working within a company where those stories and you can marinate within it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I left Crowd Favorite about two or 3 months ago, and that was a service company. That was a service company that built websites and applications for the enterprise. And so I joined them having left another enterprise software company after 8.5 years, I joined them to help them navigate some of those dynamics as they were going up market and working with enterprises, because those are the clients I know. Today, over the last couple months, I've been consulting with larger companies that are either, in the one case, like a media temple, is going up market and trying to tackle hosting for enterprises, or a handful of other companies that are trying to solve big platform, big enterprise-ish platform problems in software engineering. And so I'm as a consultant, I'm adding value as quickly as possible to make sure that they're moving forward and not stepping into gaping holes that they don't know are there because they don't know the space necessarily as well as I do, or in other cases where I'm just helping them accelerate through a set of challenges because I've seen it before. But at the same time, I'm consistently evaluating not only those companies, but others as I navigate kind of what's next. For me, the 20 years of experience around enterprise software is something that I won't naturally leave simply because of a new cool idea for product hunt. So I've been building web applications and managing the developers that build web applications for a very long time. And there's value in that expertise to deliver to other people who want to do that kind of thing. If it goes consumer, that's potentially interesting, but most of my background is in working with companies and how companies make decisions, buying decisions, utilization and deployment, the services that go along with that to get it up and running, and all of that. So RFPs and stuff, right? You don't normally have an RFP for Snapchat. So I'm not the expert in how to buy or deploy Snapchat or Pokemon Go anywhere. And yet, people are already, like, I'm already watching people turn Pokemon Go into what is really, this notion of a mobile app that connects to augmented reality. And they've been doing augmented reality for a couple of years. And so now they're Pokemon Go experts, right? And you go, that's awesome. I'm glad you're able to turn a corner and make a little pivot and pitch the next thing. For me, I'm still listening for certain sets of stories and certain kinds of problems that are bigger. I'm looking for, when you don't have, whether you're an agency or whether you're a product company, if you have 2 or 3 people writing code, that's an interesting problem to me. It's okay. If you have 20 people writing code, or you need 20 people writing code, that's a far more interesting problem for me, because a problem space for me, because it's where I have experience. When you try and put 20 people together in a coordinated effort to build a product, is very, very different, like magnitudes of order difference, than having 2 people writing a product. Most of the things you see on Product Hunt and most of the cute web apps that show up, or a cute little plugin, are a 2 or 3 person event. And most of them will not face problems where I can add value. But you put 20, 30 people together, or you need 20 or 30 people to work together to build out a product, that's a problem space that I have experience in where I can add value.
So that's where you're going to stay.
Most likely.
That's where you want to. And where does daily blogging fit into this? I honestly thought that was going to be your one thing at the beginning, just to go back and
yeah.
At this point.
Yeah. So I think what people in the WordPress space, people who are not in the software development space, people in the WordPress space know me as a guy who writes a blog, and that blog isn't even very deep. So when I joined at Crowd Favorite and I was their CTO, one of the employees was like, CTO? Like, wouldn't you be a better marketer for us? And then the CEO has to explain, well, Chris has run marketing and development organizations for 20 years. And they're like, oh, I didn't know. I only saw him on stage speak, tell stories, and write a blog about plugins. and so, different audiences know you for different things. I write regularly for a lot of reasons, but predominantly it's a helpful way for me to get stories out. It's a helpful way for me to hear stories coming back in. It's a nice feedback loop, and it keeps a pulse for me on WordPress. But I got involved in WordPress, particularly because I believed this is a platform that will find itself navigated into the enterprise space, enterprise context, and will step in. You got to remember, 5-10 years ago, if marketing wanted to spin up a new campaign, they had to call IT, and IT had to put it on their schedule right after fixing payroll. And so, my fundamental hypothesis was WordPress is a platform that's just going to get sucked in and pulled into the enterprise. It's going to get pulled into marketing departments. It's going to get pulled in to solve simple problems. And then, if it works out right, it may start solving serious problems. And so I've invested in that space because I think WordPress can do a lot for companies. But if you take a look at a company like Rainmaker, for example, Rainmaker Digital, they're solving real problems. And it just happens to be almost coincidental that they've built a platform on top of WordPress, right? They're not trying to solve a WordPress problem. They're just using WordPress to accelerate their ability to solve a bigger business problem, right? And so if you think of what does it look like to compete with HubSpot? What does it look like to build the next integrated marketing, email, outbound, inbound solution for small businesses, small and medium businesses? And even that definition of who a small and medium business has been shifting. But if you're looking at that, my fundamental hypothesis was WordPress will be used to solve those kinds of problems. And I believed that starting back when people were thinking WordPress just powers blogs. So I invest in WordPress because I believe it has a natural path towards a space I'm really comfortable with. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, yeah. And so it's not necessarily to further your career in that way. It's to keep your pulse on it and to maybe give back to the solution that you see going bigger.
So I was a public speaker. I have been a public speaker since I was a young kid. And when I moved from Northern California to Southern California about 5 years ago, I was a non-known entity in San Diego. And so nobody was inviting me to speak anywhere, not inviting me to speak at a meetup, at a conference, at a nothing. And so blogging became an easy way to get the words out that normally I would do when I'm standing in front of an audience, right? Having left the big enterprise software conferences and everything else. And so having left that space, blogging became an easy way to get involved in a space and tell stories and be helpful without having to stand on stage. And these days, of course, I speak at conferences.
A lot. Yeah, and you blog a lot. And I'm sure it also, it's turned into somewhat of a business, I'm sure, your blog. I mean, it seems quite popular, and you obviously review and recommend a lot of things.
So it's fantastic. I write a blog that is free, and I share the ideas on them for free. And then on there's a link back over to my Clarity account. And Clarity is for phone calls to give advice to other entrepreneurs. Invariably, people go from the free blog, a small percentage of them then call me on Clarity to ask specific questions. And then a small set, which I get paid for, and then a small set of those people have big enough problems that I engage in consulting with them to help them solve bigger, serious issues. And I generate revenue from that. So it all starts at the blog where you're building trust, building authority, where you're writing, where you're giving back, where you're giving away free information. And yet it ends with me working with, a large membership system that is going to have a lot of moving parts and several developers to build that out over the course of a year, right? But it started with a blog post.
I love it. And it's a great model for, anyone that wants to become an expert. And like you said, you show up in a new city and nobody even wants to invite you to a meetup to speak. And now you get to speak nationally or internationally, probably more than you even want to. I'm sure you get to turn down opportunities all the time because you put your ideas out there on this blog, which, is run off Rainmaker platform.
Well, yeah. And people fundamentally, right, people want to feel like if they're going to invite you to speak at their conference, they want to feel like they know your voice.
Yeah.
They want to feel like they trust you, they know you. Most of the time in the earlier years, when I spoke at a big technical conference, it would be with the Borlands and the Microsofts and other big companies, and I'd be working for some technical company that they had never heard of. And I would speak, and then they'd say, "Oh, wow, I appreciated that. Could you come speak at our event?" And so diffusion rate of only being recommended or only being sought after because you've spoken at another event, it's slower. And today, if you're writing a lot and you're putting yourself, you're publishing material consistently, people start hearing tone, they hear voice, they build trust. And then you get, requests that just say, "Hey, we're having this event in North Dakota. Do you happen to be free? And can we fly you out to North Dakota to speak to 500 people that are, marketers and internet people that are trying to build, products? And you're like, yeah, okay, that works on my schedule, or it doesn't, right? But it's because they've been listening or reading the blog more than going to an event where you were speaking.
Yeah, I love it. I love it, Chris. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to stop by today. We've talked about this blog now and Clarity, but could you specifically tell the listener where to find you on the web, where they could maybe track you down on social media, and if you have a Clarity link for them?
Absolutely. So I am at chrislema.com, CHRISLEMA.com. And I'm also at Chris Lema on Twitter. And then if you go to clarity.fm/Chris Lema, you also find me there.
Excellent. Excellent. So reach out to Chris on his site on Clarity if you have any product questions. And if nothing else, definitely follow him on Twitter and keep up with everything that he is up to. So Chris, once again, thank you so much for stopping by. I 100% truly appreciate it. And just please keep doing what you're doing because it is awesome and inspiring to watch.
Thanks. You take care.
Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. That was a lot of fun. I've wanted to have you on the show for a long time, so I'm glad we finally found the time to meet up and do that. And you out there listening, I hope you learned as much from Chris as I did about his marinating within the problem space and sort of building the story. And as you were listening to this conversation, I'm wondering, did you notice anything that Chris said? Did anything stand out to you? I don't know. I think it's time to go back and take a look because there was one thing that Chris said. I think you know which one it was, right? Let's do it. Let's find the hack.
I started working with the web in the tail end of 1994 when the web started. In 95, I heard the first pitch of someone saying, most patients just get frustrated because they want to make an appointment with a doctor and they can't do it over the web. And it would be great if they could just do it over the web. That happened in 95. People pitched it in 97. They pitched it in 99. They pitched it in 2003, in 2007, in 2010, in 2013, and this last year. And everybody and their brother is like, oh, this is just I can't believe no one's done this already. And you're like, well, actually, the reality is tons of people have tried it already. And they've all failed. And they failed because at the core of it, for the same reason that most software doesn't exist inside of a mechanic shop, the population that runs a mechanic shop or that runs a doctor's office are people who are over 50, over 60, and fundamentally don't want to adopt your technology because it's slower for them than a clipboard, a piece of paper, and a pen.
And that's the hack. Chris. I have to say it just now. This is why I wanted you on the show for so long. For this very thing. The idea of finding out the problem or what it is you're trying to solve, right? It's about finding that problem, creating software or building a product that can solve that problem. But oftentimes getting so caught up in ourselves and getting so caught up in what we think the problem and the solution should be, we fail to acknowledge and accept and try and really truly determine who this is for. And, as Chris points out, more importantly, if they ever even want this. So doctor appointment scheduling software. Everybody should want it. What do you say? 95, 97, 99, 2003, 2007, 10, 13, and 2015. It was pitched, and people are shocked that it doesn't exist. Because it doesn't exist, it must mean that it's something really, really good. That is not only not always true, it's not usually true. Right? I remember, I'll link to it in the show notes, but I remember having a discussion about a year ago on the show with the brilliant entrepreneur Laura Roeder, who created Meet Edgar and has scaled her business just huge, exponentially into hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in recurring revenue now. And the discussion with her was, how did you think about entering a market that was already sort of dominated by larger companies that were like fixed and that were in the market really well, and some smaller ones that were nimble, yet they had the advantage of being in there for a couple of years. And she just said there's always going to be people who are going to use other services anyways. It doesn't matter. And she prefers to enter a market that has people in it. So this is sort of the other side, but also it's following the exact same sort of philosophy that Chris is saying, which is you don't want to typically enter markets where something doesn't exist, or if it doesn't exist and you do really want it, don't just assume that it's because nobody's thought about it. Because as Chris just proved with Doctor Appointment or mechanic software, it was pitched up to 20 times already. And it's just not a valid market. So because it doesn't exist doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great idea. Look and try and find out if other people have tried and if they have failed, because you can either learn from that or you can just decide that that is totally not the right market. Chris, thank you so much for joining me. All right, that was a lot of fun. So with Laura's episode, I'll link to that in the show notes for you, as well as Chris's blog, because I think you should really check it out. And if you want to continue talking to him, you can track him down. He's on Twitter a lot, which is really cool. And then off of his blog, you can also find him on Clarity. If you had product or, I'm going to say, problem you need marinated, he can help you, and with storytelling. All right, it's been a lot of fun. I thank you so much for joining me. HackTheEntrepreneur.com is the website. Make sure to go there and get onto the email list so you can be part of my Sunday emails that go out. I would love to have you there. All right, it's been fun. I appreciate you stopping by. I truly, truly do. And please, until next time, keep hacking the entrepreneur.